Hey guys, welcome back to another Realm of the Mad God video. Last episode we talked about the untiered white bag weapons that I felt were kind of deserving of buffs, or at least they could use some kind of touch up. And in this video we're going to be talking about the UT abilities that need buffs. I actually started out with 5, but then I decided, you know what, we're going to add in one more because I completely forgot about this ability, so let's just get right into it. Just like the weapons, I'm intentionally avoiding abilities that are meant to be gimmicky or silly, so any of the abilities that come from machines such as like Shield of Pogmer or stuff like that. If you guys enjoyed this video and are looking forward to the Armors and Rings video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe for more Realm of the Mad God content. But without further ado, let's cover the list. First ability on the list is Cnidaria Rod. If you give it a first glance, it's not actually that bad. It's basically a scepter with weak base damage, but it increases for every subsequent enemy hit, unlike the other scepters that do less damage for each enemy hit. The scepter also does give a nice boost in defense, dex, and wisdom, all stats the sorcerer can make use of, and the MP cost matches the tiered scepter, so you don't have to spend more. The proof is in the pudding. You want to use the scepter for when you're dealing with large hordes of enemies such as in Godlands, or when you're fighting a bunch of Lost Halls enemies, so on and so forth. That would normally be the ideal scenario for the Cnidaria Rod, but here's where I think this item needs a buff. Ordinarily, the sorcerer class is considered one of, if not the best mobbing class in the game, with wands having high range and piercing and their scepters being designed to take out crowds of enemies quickly. Remember when I discussed in the weapons video that you need incentives to use an item. While it is really helpful to use a Cnidaria Rod against large crowds of enemies, you need to be hitting a lot of them, and there are very few circumstances where using anything other than regular tiered scepters or maybe Follow Me is unideal, since Sorks can already wave clear very efficiently. And to fully maximize this scepter, you need to force a full Wizmod build. In harder dungeons, that puts the Sork at dangerously low max HP and defense. In fact, most players opt to stack as much HP and defense on sorcerers to maximize survivability, since they can already deal decent damage on their own without Wizmod. The best way I would consider buffing Cnidaria Rod is to remove its increasing damage entirely and instead just make it a support scepter. We already have the Fulmination giving slow, so I was thinking maybe adding a scepter that could give Daze. I know Daze is a pretty risky debuff to put on an ability since it is really broken against a lot of bosses, but Daze is a huge part of the Cnidarian Reef boss battle, and I think it would fit more thematically. We could add a cooldown onto the Cnidaria Rod of like 6 seconds and narrow the targeting cone to make it harder to aim with. I like that the Cnidaria Rod could do significant damage against large crowds, but that's kind of superfluous given the sorcerer's already high clearing speed. So I think reworking it to be a support scepter is the better course of option. Next is the Sealed Crystal Skull. It's an upgraded version of the Cracked Crystal Skull, and its unique attribute is that it has a huge absorption radius of 5 as opposed to regular tiered skulls 3.75. So if you use it on a large crowd, you can potentially heal for a lot more since you can cover a large area. The skull still provides you with a solid boost in HP, Dex, and Vitality, never a bad thing. Now, while it's awesome to have a Necromancer be essentially a DPS priest, the Sealed Skull is a solution in search of a problem, much like, a lot of these items. Its incentive for use is to allow you to get a larger amount of healing per usage if you go for large groups of enemies. But most classes average between 700 to 1000 health. The Tier 6 Bloodsucker Skull heals for 110 HP per enemy hit, and despite having less range than the Crystal Skull, 3.75 is still a decent amount of space. Especially since enemies have no collision hitboxes in Realm, so you could have several 10s stacked on the same tile and it wouldn't really make a difference. All you need to do to heal most players to full HP is hit 6 or so enemies. That's not hard to do. And even if you can only hit 1 or 2, if you're fighting a boss, that's still a large chunk of HP. There's not a use for this skull compared to its fellow peers, because each of those skulls have some unique function that the tier skulls can just not perform. We have Esbin Skull, it slows enemies. We have Endless Torment from Shaitan that acts as like a Puri. Corrupted Souls from the Cult that inflicts curse. Memento Mori is just damage, and Cranium, it makes like a blood-sucking plant. But the Crystal Skull is just the same as a tiered skull, it's just meant for mobbing, and even that isn't that impressive since the tiered skull do their job just fine. My suggestion actually is to buff this skull by giving it the ability to overheal targets and add a shield. I always wonder why Realm doesn't have HP shields you can place on allies that can block like a flat amount of damage. This would make the skull amazing to use, especially against harder bosses where dodging is difficult to do and you have to just rely on priest or marble seal. So if you know a phase is coming up soon where your party is going to be taking huge amounts of damage, you can stack up an HP shield and then maybe add I don't know, we'll add a property onto the skull to where it gives like a 30 HP shield and it scales a whiz mod for each enemy struck that lasts for 5 seconds. Then we can drastically increase the mana cost so you can't just spam it and then give everyone like a 2k HP shield. If we really want to embrace the skull's massive healing property, I can't think of a better buff to add than just an ability to excess heal into a shield. You knew this is coming. I'm sorry, but Plague Poison just sucks. Even after it got buffed already, I think before it was like 500 damage over 10 seconds or something like that. Now it's 800 damage over 10 seconds with a huge radius of 9. But just like the Cnidaria Rod and Sealed Crystal Skull, the point of Plague is to be used as a wave clearing tool, not so much DPS. And while I think it is nice to give assassins some form of wave clear, Plague is just too weak of an item. Half the time if you're taking on groups of enemies in a party, they'll only deal about 2 to 3 ticks of poison damage before going down, which is like less than 300. Not to mention it has a throw time of 1.5 seconds, which means by the time it lands, perhaps half of the enemies would already be dead by then. I can't see an effective use for Plague Poison over standard Bane Serpent since it's still a pretty solid radius with higher damage over a shorter period of time. However, this is something I think could be a pretty cool buff to Plague. Remember how the Cnidaria Rod increased its damage the more targets struck, right? That would be the perfect component to add on Plague Poison. The definition of a plague is a very contagious bacterial disease. Keyword, contagious. What we could do for the Plague Poison is to keep the long damage over time duration, but instead make it so the damage significantly ramps up each second if there are other infected enemies nearby. So, if you throw it onto a large crowd, let's say a crusade or in Godlands and there's like 50 of them, you could potentially clear all of them out with a single poison if they're tightly packed together. The main weakness with this poison is that it doesn't do enough damage quickly enough, to the point where using a tier 6 poison would just do the job more effectively with maybe a couple extra casts. Alternatively, another way to buff this poison would be to greatly increase the dot duration from like 10 seconds to 60 seconds and amp the total damage to 5,000 or something. That way, if you want to use this on a boss battle that takes a long time like Marble Colossus or Void, you can keep chucking Plague Poison at it and scale up that damage. But I think that could potentially be exploitable and you can like insta bosses through phases, but you know, we can find a way to work around that. Regardless, it just needs more damage. I like the concept of a poison with a huge area of effect, but it's too benign for you to want to use it over a Bane Serpent or Fang's Venom. The Penetrating Blast spell has always been a spell I really wished was good. Funnily enough, it has the same acronym as a Peanut Butter Sandwich or a PBS TV show, but that's besides the point. It's a spell that has piercing shots. It deals significantly less damage than regular spells to compensate, but it's cheaper on mana cost by like I think 15 compared to the regular tiered spells, so you can cast it more frequently. However, while this spell is helpful for allowing wizards to clear large groups of enemies more quickly, half the problem it shares with the Cnidaria Rod and the other half it shares with Plague Poison. Wizards may not be as effective as sorcerers when it comes to wave clear, but they're still really efficient at it, especially if you're at endgame territory and you're using like a cult staff or something. And even in mid-game, you know, they're no slouch to clearing things like Godlands and other dungeons with high enemy counts. Mostly just on account of the fact that they can stay far away from enemies and they have really high attack speed. So the need for a mobbing spell isn't the first concern on players who play Wizard because it's a solution searching for a problem that doesn't really exist. On the other half of the spectrum, just like Plague Poison, the damage is just so low that even with a lower MP cost, there's almost no reason to use PBS over a regular spell since you're just doing no damage to begin with. The average damage is 75 per shot. The average for an Eladet is 122.5. That's a little over half. Way too much damage lost for a spell meant to clear large groups of enemies quickly. While I had creative ideas for the previous 3 abilities, I think the only thing we need for PBS is just more damage. Bring its average to about 90 to 100, that should be perfectly fine. It would still be weaker than a tiered spell or ancient spell Pierce when it comes to DPS on single targets, but it wouldn't just be a small gust of wind either. I really like this spell, just needs to hurt a little more. Okay, I'm starting to actually notice while I'm writing the script that we have kind of a trend here on all the abilities on this list. They're essentially just the mobbing counterparts of their respective class abilities. Well, I mean, it just goes to show you we could probably use a complete overhaul on those abilities that incentivize usage on huge clumps of enemies. Kageboshi, basically the star that can pierce through enemies, making it the proverbial wave-clearing star, and then you use Doom Circle for single target. Unlike Wizard and Sorcerer, ninjas aren't the best class when it comes to mobbing since katanas, despite being able to pierce, have really short range, and ninjas are squishy, so they're being screwed from both ends. Having a mobbing star like Kageboshi is nice to have some sort of way to circumvent that, since ninjas can use it to safely clear groups of enemies from a respectable distance. They do need the star, actually. But just like the penetrating blast spell, Kageboshi just doesn't do enough damage. It's also a very uninteresting star to begin with. You lose half of your damage from a Doom Circle to use a Kageboshi. Not only that, but ninja stars aren't famous for their area of effect either. They're really narrow and they only shoot in a straight line. At least with the Plague Poison and PBS, they covered a huge range to try to catch as many enemies as possible. But the star has the same hitbox size as a Doom Circle with half the range. Remember what I said regarding the Queen Stinger and Esmond Staff from the weapons video? In order for a mobbing weapon to be effective, it has to be able to target a huge amount of enemies at once. That's one thing the Penetrating Blast Spell and Plague Poison do right. The Kageboshi fails in both aspects. It's weak and short-ranged. See, the name Kageboshi roughly translates to Shadow Star, so I was thinking a fantastic buff for the star would be to have it so if it hits a target, it explodes into a nova of Shadow Stars from that location. Just like a Shadow Arrow or Frag Bomb where it explodes on impact and damages nearby enemies, another proposal would be to make the Kageboshi really big, like twice if not thrice the size of regular stars, and then have it shoot out and then come back towards you like a boomerang star. There's a lot of creative ways you can make a ninja star that I think Deca really missed out on, and while they have a lot of other cool stars like the Chakram or the Midnight Star, all of them shoot in a straight line. They're a ninja. You should be able to have them do all sorts of fancy crazy stuff with it, you know? Last but not least, Toma of Pain, or T-Pain. It's basically a tome that sacrifices a lot of healing to be able to deal damage to enemies around you. I'm gonna be quick with this one since the video is getting kinda long. The Priest is not a damage-oriented class, and it's not good of a rusher either. The only use I would see from this tome would be if you were rushing a dungeon and wanted to quickly eliminate enemies that are chasing after you or piling on top of you, like in Abyss of Demons. Once again, Priests are terrible rushers if they're not using prod. And Tome of Pain actually hurts your survivability by reducing your HP and vitality. At 75 wisdom, it does a respectable 420 damage within 5.8 tiles. So it's kind of like a concentrated Extreme Prejudice staff burst, but there are very few instances, if any, where you would really want to use T-Pain. Unlike the other 5 abilities I mentioned so far, I can't think of a way to buff T-Pain because you're trying to make Priest a DPS class, but they're the last one you want to use for DPS, so I'm kind of at a loss. There's only one way I think you can buff this tome, and I think that would be to have it so you can deal damage on a targeted area like where your curse is pointed at, like a skull or spell bomb. Not the most original idea out there, but I think it's fine. We have a skull that sort of functions like a tome of purification. That's really all I have for T-Pain. Parasite Chamber white bags are great. The recurring terror spell is amazing, Scepter of Devastation makes sorcerers deadly snipers, but the T-Pain is, for all intents and purposes, the Ring of the Sphinx or Twilight Gemstone of the chambers. It is the white bag of the 3 that you really do not want to have. I think there's a lot of potential with these different abilities, but they definitely need an overhaul. Not to mention, there's probably still a plethora of other UT abilities that desperately need touch-ups, so I might do a 2.0 or something later on. But let me know what you guys think about my choices, if you agree or disagree with them, or if you think that there are other abilities that need more buffs than these 6. But mobbing abilities in general are just not as good as they used to be, since we're in the steamroll meta, so clearing waves of enemies is pretty easy to do nowadays. And there aren't many situations where you're up against a ton of enemies that are hard to kill with single target weapons and abilities, so we do need to retrofit them, keep up with the current power progression of Realm. That being said, hope you guys enjoyed this episode of items that need buffs. If you're looking forward to the Armor and Rings episodes coming soon, I hope you can show your support by leaving a like and subscribing so you can stay tuned for them in the future, as well as more Realm content. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next video. Take care.